Welcome to video lecture 3, which focuses on Hick, chapter 3, and the dismantling of the social welfare state in Canada. This video lecture uses the PowerPoint presentation from the publisher with a few modifications, and the deck with the changed slides has been uploaded to Blackboard, as well as the original deck created by the publisher. I'm Tara LaRose, and I'll be hosting this video lecture. Hick begins with a discussion of the era of retrenchment, which he sees as beginning in and around 1975. This was an era of global economic retrenchment, more generally, and an era of recession and high inflation. These produced a hesitancy by governments to continue to institutionalize social welfare, and therefore reduced spending became part of the mantra of social welfare in this time period. Globalization was also an important element shaping our understanding of this particular period of time in Canada, as the Canadian economy became more integrated with other global economies and therefore directly affected or impacted by changes in economic realities in other places and spaces. Wide cuts to social welfare ensued, and this gradually changed the landscape of social welfare in Canada. Hick speaks about neoliberalism, linking neoliberalism to this era in the 1970s when the social welfare infrastructure began to be dismantled. But we can understand this particular era also as neoconservatism. Neoliberalism is, to my mind, a slightly more contemporary term, but there are a lot of overlaps between the two. For example, the dismantling of the welfare state and the decline in economic growth, resulting in part because of global economic reductions and recessions. Neoliberalism sees the creation of the welfare state or the maintenance of the welfare state as something that is undesirable, as it has the potential to affect economic growth among for-profit organizations. There was a time when we spoke about this era as a neoconservative era, but there are a lot of similarities between these two perspectives, so we'll go with Hick's conversation about neoliberalism. Under neoliberalism, corporate interests or corporate communities have significant influence over decisions that are made about social welfare. Inflation and unemployment in the early part of the neoliberal era was extremely high, making debt a very difficult thing to repay. I have included another perspective or definition on neoliberalism presented by Baines. Baines really emphasizes neoliberalism as a lived experience, as something that social workers face in a practical way at work. It's not a favorable perspective to social work, and it challenges or conflicts with many of our values and the outcomes that we desire as workers. Since about the 1970s and through to about 1984, Canadians concerned themselves with the concept of a guaranteed annual income. Many people believe that this is a significant benefit to the general population, as it replaces the complex welfare system that requires a lot of social administration. However, the idea of providing a guaranteed annual income to people produces some conflict among political parties. Both the Liberals and the Conservatives are more concerned with other kinds of financial activities rather than supporting the general population around issues like guaranteed income supplements. The Trudeau government considered the GIA at one point in time, eventually giving up on it due to the expense of existing social programs and the fear that introducing yet another social program may lead to massive debt. Brian Mulroney began his reign in an era when governments in the UK and the US were engaged in significant attacks on the welfare state. There are a lot of documents and a lot of documentaries that you can find on YouTube and the internet if you're interested in finding more out about things like Thatcherism or Reaganomics. Both of these leaders fundamentally changed the ways in which the social welfare infrastructure in each of their respective countries was administered. Canada's signing of the Free Trade Agreement in 1988 further entrenched our relationship with other global communities, and therefore wrapped us up in some of the policies and procedures related to these kinds of trade agreements and the welfare state. Mulroney largely claimed or blamed social welfare programs and services for creating debt and deficit at the national level. Mulroney threatened Canadians by suggesting that the level of debt and deficit held by the country could make us an unappealing trade partner. Mulroney used these arguments to justify significant changes in the social welfare infrastructure in Canada, as well as changes to particular social programs such as the family allowance. Mulroney really changed the face of Canadian society and changed a lot of the attitudes we had towards universal program delivery. This was kind of a strange era in Canadian politics, with the introduction of the Reform Party and the decline of the Conservative Party and a lot of amalgamations and other interesting things that happened. But it really did reflect a time in Canadian politics when we took a jump to the right and became a lot more conservative than we had been historically. The Liberals, when they took power, made a number of other changes to the Canadian social welfare infrastructure, changing some of the social programs and taxation programs that had long existed in Canadian society, and embracing more neoliberal policies, as well as changing the CAP system from CAP to the CHST, which we'll talk more about in a future chapter. The federal Liberals made a lot of changes to the social welfare infrastructure in Canada, changing a number of federally supervised programs like employment insurance and eliminating some universally accessible programs. The loss of these programs and the changes to other programs meant that lower-income Canadians were in a much more vulnerable position than they had been in the past. A greater gap between the rich and the poor in Canada was created, and wealthy people seemed to gain a lot from income tax cuts that were created by the Liberal government. Between 1993 and 2006, under Paul Martin, the Liberals continued to make changes. Some political scandals like the sponsorship scandal also shook Canadians' confidence in the government and in the kinds of programs and services that they developed and delivered. There were a number of failed social reform attempts, like the introduction of a national daycare. Instead, we ended up with a national daycare funding regime that provides a very low amount of money to every child in Canada that wouldn't even cover a single month of daycare. It would appear that a lot of instability in government and political parties also produced some instability among the values and beliefs of Canadians and their commitment to party politics. Harper maintained a minority government from 2006 to 2011, and the Conservatives were forced to work with other parties, in particular the NDP, in order to maintain their balance of power. But even during this time, further social program cuts occurred, although they were slowed because of the minority government and the need for Harper to cooperate with other parties. There is still a belief that the market economy is the best way to meet the needs of people, and that government should stay out of interfering in the economy through things like the introduction of social programs. This is a very ideological position, and thinking about how this relates to ideology can be an important consideration for social workers. A great example of the kinds of changes that occurred during this era is reflected in one of the videos that I've linked on Blackboard for you, and that is the dismantling of Regent Park, which was Canada's first major social housing program. Regent Park is being redeveloped from a public housing community to predominantly a private ownership community where there are a few condo units allocated for rental by people who are low-income renters. However, the selling of this public housing community to private venture means that we really no longer have a public housing community in this area. This kind of dismantling and selling off of the housing stock in Canada is occurring all over Ontario and across the country. It really reflects some of the conservative policy outcomes related to both fiscal and social activities. Hick reminds us that cuts to the GST and cuts to services around child poverty, or the reintroduction of reduced or altered child poverty programs, are other examples of neoliberalism and its effect on Canadian social welfare programs. The Conservatives have been under a lot of pressure to provide increased and different resources to First Nations people all across Canada. However, they haven't always been successful in creating these reforms. We've certainly seen things like the apology from Prime Minister Harper around the residential school system, but we still haven't seen the abolition of the Indian Act or significant reforms that would promote First Nations self-governance in Canada. So as Hick points out, Conservative policy has to some degree focused on First Nation policies, but these policies haven't necessarily produced significant changes in the lived experiences of First Nations people in Canada. Cuts from the Conservative government have really covered us cradle to grave. We can see here, in the slide provided by the publisher, that the pension reform is another example of social welfare changes created by the Conservative government. The pension eligibility age for old age security has been raised from 65 to 67, meaning that the poorest people in Canada who receive only the OAS won't be able to receive this pension until they turn 67 as of 2023. There have also been cuts to private pensions provided to federal workers, and their contributions to these pension plans have increased. There have also been increases in the payments that we make to CPP and QPP. EI is another area where the Conservative government has made a lot of changes. In particular, changes have occurred to the benefits for seasonal workers. There was a time when seasonal work was understood to be a part of the reality of work in Canada. We have pretty severe winters, we're a resource-based economy, and an economy with a lot of agricultural activity. Crops don't grow here 365 days a year, and so sometimes workers are unemployed, but then they work extremely hard during other periods of the year. However, the Conservative government appears to be reframing seasonal work as something that speaks to a person's ambition or their morality. And so there's a disincentive to access unemployment insurance multiple times in one's life, and there are penalties for workers who use employment insurance frequently. The Conservative government has also reformed immigration policy, making it more difficult to immigrate to Canada, making family sponsorship more difficult, and encouraging entrepreneurship and business-based or wealth-based immigration. There's a significant backlog of applications to immigrate to Canada, and a number of applications which were backlogged for an extended period of time were thrown out by the government. There's also been a lot of controversy around the Foreign Workers Program, and you'll see that I've included a few videos that explore some of the exploitation and challenges faced by people who were working under this particular government program. The Conservative government sees the physical environment of Canada as a resource to be exploited, rather than something that we must protect and preserve for future generations. There have been a number of changes to environmental policy, eroding many environmental protections. And the environmental ministries in Canada have had a number of setbacks or cutbacks that mean there are fewer resources, there are fewer dollars to support things like inspections and investigations. Support for economically focused activities like the introduction of oil pipelines across many provinces in Canada and into the US have also produced a number of concerns by the general population about our commitment and concern for the physical environment and for the earth. Since the 1980s, the Conservative government has invested a lot of time and energy in downloading services and programs and the costs associated with services and programs to the provincial government. The elimination of the Canadian Assistance Program, or the Canada Assistance Program, or CAP as we refer to it, and its replacement with the CHST definitely changed the relationship between the federal government and the provincial governments when it comes to social welfare services. The introduction of the CHST meant that when provinces ran out of money for health care, they were forced to dip into their social welfare spending pool or other spending pools that they had, or to run a deficit. In order to create greater controls over this, the federal government severed the CHST, creating the health transfer and the social transfer. But this still means that when provincial governments spend more than the budgeted amount or the maximum amount allocated for health care or social care, that this spending either becomes a deficit or has to be supplemented through some other revenue source. Hick has done a good job of really conveying to us the fact that upper income earners have benefited most from these changes in the social welfare infrastructure. Lower income Canadians have not benefited, and changes that occurred under governments like the Mike Harris government in Ontario and the Conservative governments in provinces like Alberta have also left people who are living with a low income in a very, very tight financial situation, which we know produces a number of other potential social harms. Corporate interests have also benefited from these changes, and many corporations at the global level have huge increases in their income, which are not being redistributed to their employees or to the general public through taxation. The Conservative government really sees this as a positive step, as they believe that social welfare spending and social welfare programs negatively affect the potential of the market economy to do what it can do to benefit Canadians as a whole. Thus, the Conservative government hopes to, really remove itself from the day-to-day functioning of Canadians' lives. They create what many people refer to as a hollow state, a state whose business is really governing governance rather than actually providing services or supports to the general population. Well, this concludes the lecture, and I hope that you can see through these slides and my discussion of the slides that the neo in neoliberal is really the con in conservative. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the lecture, and I'll look forward to speaking to you again when you watch the lecture for Chapter 4.